Hello, fellow Darksiders. So today we are going to be entering our next entry into the villain competency tier list, and today it's going to be a personal favorite of mine, mostly because of the film franchise it originates from, that being Michael Bay's Transformers series. More specifically, we're going to be looking at the primary antagonist throughout all five movies of this series, Megatron himself, the big bad, the quintessential Transformers villain, so to speak. And I decided to start with Bayformers for a few reasons, because I will go over the other versions of Megatron on this competency tier list. But I started with the Bayformers one because it's the one I'm most familiar with. More so because my first exposure to Transformers was in Michael Bay's movies, and secondly because his lore is pretty simplistic compared to other versions of Megatron, where he has like really deep and sort of layered, complex motivations, like that you'd have to spend a lot of time going over to really examine like both why he did what he did and his competency level. Compared to that, the Bayformers Megatron, he does have some nuance if you really want to read between the lines, but overall he's just kind of a barbarian murderer who wants to wipe out the human race and believes Cybertronians are the supreme leaders of the entire universe, that kind of thing. Basically a racial supremacist military warlord. That's the best way I can describe him. So before we get into his exact competency level and where exactly he fits onto my tier list, I want to go over specifically his motivations, his originations, and why he became um, this massive genocidal threat to the universe. So with that out of the way, let's get right into it. So Bayformers Megatron, similar to a lot of other versions of Megatron, was born as a soldier. He was born from the all-giving Allspark, the life-giving Allspark, which was the kind of originator and the sort of god of the Transformers race, excluding the 13 Primes. But he was sort of created to be this machine of war, this sort of artifice of destruction, and through his role as the soldier, as the high protector of Cybertron, as I suppose you could say, because he did attain that role later on in life. He, alongside his brother Optimus Prime and his adoptive father Sentinel Prime, though at that point Optimus Prime was just Optimus, they fought together with a faction of their allies and loyalists against various tribal organizations that believed that the Allspark shouldn't be tampered with. That tampering with the Allspark was sort of the be all end all, this apocalyptic sort of harbinger of doom in their, primitive religion. Megatron wanted to wipe all of them out, and Megatron sort of built a following within Sentinel's faction of like warlike, barbaric Cybertronians that enjoyed the thrill of combat and enjoyed the sort of slaughter that came with warfare, which I suppose is the same thing. But the point of the matter is, after Sentinel Prime did some, machinations with the Allspark, he managed to rejuvenate Cybertron back to its golden era, and with it, he initiated an age of prosperity for the Cybertronian people, which also included expansion across the stars and an end to the warfare that Megatron and his followers loved so dearly. And this is kind of where the problems already began. We can already see cracks starting to form because Megatron, he enjoys brutality, he enjoys conquest, he enjoys the feeling of crushing an enemy's skull beneath his servos. So to him, the ushering in of a peaceful age has only made him redundant. He's made Lord High Protector of Cybertron's defense forces, and he clearly doesn't enjoy this role that much because he really wants to be on the front lines. He doesn't want to be at home, just kind of dawdling about. And to make matters worse, Sentinel Prime is very clearly favoring Optimus over Megatron because Sentinel views Optimus as a more productive and helpful individual. Optimus is placed in charge of the science division, and as Sentinel views him as the next leader of their race compared to Megatron, who is just kind of a brute force tool used to crush his enemies and so on and so forth. So long story short, eventually Megatron comes into contact with the Fallen. The Fallen corrupts him, and this leads into him and his followers forming the Decepticons and, attempting to take over Cybertron through military force. And obviously, that leads into a whole series of events where the Autobots jettison the Allspark into space. Megatron tries to pursue it, and in doing so, he ends up crashing into Earth through the Arctic Circle, where he is discovered centuries later by Sam Witwicky's ancestor, Archibald Witwicky, and Section 8, Sector 7, actually, what am I saying? Section 8. Sector 7, this secret government agency, is founded to protect the secret of Megatron and use him to reverse engineer great innovations that help humanity technologically in the coming eras. So that's the kind of the gist of Megatron. Let's just get right into his competency. Personally, it's a kind of a mixed bag for me because as a villain and as a character, Megatron is always seems to be kind of on the down low. After the first movie, which admittedly he is very fearsome and very terrifying and very powerful in, and he almost does secure the Allspark, Megatron after that movie just becomes a patsy to several other villains, namely the Fallen, Sentinel Prime. In the fourth movie, he's kind of Galvatron, so he's just kind of working on his own again. And I don't know what, because that movie was a really confusing plot wise. I think he was trying to go after the Seed to try and create his own new generation of Cybertronian soldiers to help take over the world of Earth and maybe reform it into Cybertron. I have no idea. And in the fifth movie, he tries to bring back Cybertron again, like he did in Dark of the Moon, except this time he's serving under Quintessa. So you have all these different individuals that Megatron serves under the course of the Bayformers, which really makes you wonder, like, how much of a villain can this guy be if he's always playing second fiddle to someone else, right? Like in the first movie, he's leading this elite task force of Decepticon juggernauts and warriors. It's only like a 6 or 7 Decepticons in total, right? And they still manage to tear up Mission City. They almost destroy the Autobots, bring the human military, well, the American military, to their knees. And then afterwards, after he dies in that movie, and then later on in Revenge of the Fallen, when he's brought back, he just kind of becomes this lumbering sort of savant for other villains. And this is only compounded by the fact that apparently in Bayformers canon, Megatron made several secretive, clandestine deals with the individuals he's working for, primarily because he's aligned with the Fallen, right? The evil Prime that turned against his brothers and, now has press ganged Megatron into his service. And so he's serving the Fallen publicly, but apparently he also made a deal with Sentinel Prime that Sentinel and him would rendezvous on Earth and use these artifacts called the Pillars, which we'll get into that more later. But they were going to use these artifacts called the Pillars to bring Cybertron into Earth's atmosphere and use Earth's population as a slave workforce to rebuild it. So yeah, you'd have to wonder, like, what if the Fallen and Sentinel Prime were just around at the same time, and they just encountered each other, and they're like, wait a second, Megatron made a deal with you? No, Megatron made a deal with me, and they would just be like super confused. And honestly, that would make for a really funny encounter, someday, because you just imagine Sentinel Prime and the Fallen just kind of just talking to each other for a second, after fighting for a bit, and then they just both turn to Megatron simultaneously, and they're like, "Wait a second, excuse me?" And Megatron just kind of shrugs. I mean, knowing Megatron as a character in the Bayformers, he did just want to bring back his homeworld of Cybertron, and I guess to that end, he was willing to commit to any atrocity and make a deal with anyone, really, to make that a reality. But that's still just really no excuse, and I know a lot of it is just kind of lazy writing. I know Revenge of the Fallen was heavily affected by the writer's strike in 2009, and Bay in general is not really known for his nuanced, complex stories. Most of the lore for Bayformers Megatron that I'm actually reading to you guys right now was made by comic writers and novelists who made novelizations of the Bayformers movies and comics depicting past events that took place in the Bayformers canon. So Michael Bay was not exactly someone who cared much about these details. So of course I'm going to give Bayformers some slack on this because, of course, Michael Bay wasn't really thinking about the intricacies of Megatron's storyline, and he had other people do it for him. So, of course, that reflects onto the character itself, as I just said. But yeah, the thing is, I still have to, like, when I do villain competency, I still have to examine the villain in the context that they're portrayed, and I am looking at these 5 movies, primarily the first 3 movies, because I mean, let's be honest, the fourth movie is really weird. I didn't like the fourth or fifth movies at all. This just kind of just going off topic into a bit of a tangent, but I just did not like Transformers 4 or 5 whatsoever. But even if you look at the first 3 movies, after the first movie, and even then, like in the first movie, Megatron gets outdone by like a teenage boy whose online alias is Ladies Man 217. He gets like an all spark stuck in his chest and he blows up. And in that movie as well, he just kind of spends all of his time just roving after Optimus the moment he sees him instead of like going for the Allspark first. Which to be fair, the Allspark was with Optimus at that time, but I feel like he was just allowing hatred to get the better of him at that point, which is always a detractor for villains if they can't let their emotions be momentarily quelled for the purpose of achieving their goals. And then in the second movie, in Revenge of the Fallen, he becomes this like bulky, hideous mess of metal, which is like even worse than the form he had in the last movie, because at least in the last movie he had his access to his Cybertronian jet form, and he has a pretty cool triple changing form in the second movie, but he doesn't really make much use of it. He does hold out pretty admirably against the against Lennox and his soldiers during the second movie, during the Battle of Egypt, during in the Battle of the Ruins and stuff. He is like one of the last Decepticons standing, which just goes to show his excellent skills as a warrior and as a elite sort of commander of his troops. Like whenever Megatron is on the field, I'm sure that his fellow Decepticons are really eager and excited to go into battle with him because they see him as this sort of arbiter of destruction, this avatar of damnation, right? And they just get really excited. They're like, I'm fighting alongside the Megatron himself. And he does everything he can to puff up this idea, despite the fact that he is working for so many different people for the sole purpose of reviving Cybertron, because that's really all he wants. All he wants is to revive Cybertron. Everything else is just theater for that. And we can see that too in movie 3, Dark of the Moon, when he willingly gives up his reputation and his posture as leader of the Decepticons because he just kind of hands over the throne to Sentinel Prime. I mean, unwillingly, inadvertently, to be fair. And at the end of the movie, he does grow some balls and, like, well, grow some like those Devastator, like I am directly below the enemy scrotum. You know what I'm talking about. But he does grow some balls and shoot at Sentinel and try and take him out at the end of the movie and saves Optimus's life. But then in doing that, Optimus just kind of rips his face off and just like chops his head in two with his Energon axe. So you gotta wonder, like I think most of Megatron's plans are very short lived. And apparently in Dark of the Moon, the novelization it kind of makes it canonical that Megatron genuinely did want peace with Optimus after saving his life from Sentinel, and Optimus very clearly and very rightfully, in my opinion, seeing the dude who has led this brutal genocide against his people and that of humanity for several years, and I mean several millennia at this point, does not trust Megatron whatsoever, so murders him. I don't know what Megatron was thinking that Optimus would be willingly ready to accept a peace with someone who has functioned as his arch nemesis and as his race's version of Genghis Khan, Mao Zedong, Hitler, Stalin for like God knows how long at that point that he would just be ready and willing to accept that truth. So that really does hurt his competency a lot. Like I don't really think that Megatron is a very competent leader. He does all these schemes, admittedly, throughout the movies. He does hatch all these schemes to acquire these like endless series of relics, like the Allspark, the Matrix of Leadership, the Pillars, the Seed, the Staff of Quintessa. I mean, he does all these sort of convoluted plots to acquire these relics, but then either they're stolen from him and used by the actual villain of the film, or he doesn't really make use of them whatsoever. Like, he activates the Sun Harvester, and Optimus blows it up in a second. He gets the Pillars, and fucking the Autobots and the human military just blow them all up in the span of, like, a single battle in Chicago. He gets the Seed, and it's just proceeded to be stolen from him, and Optimus like goes to confront the Quintessons at Cortessa or whatever, and then he like serves Quintessa and he gets the staff, and then Optimus shows up, and guess what, he takes it back from him in like the span of a few minutes of a fight scene. I mean, at some point you gotta wonder like what this guy is thinking to like be repeating the same cycle over and over again with no real result. um, and it's kind of embarrassing for me because I do enjoy his character. I do enjoy the Bayformers. I mean, at least the first three Bayformers, mostly for the nostalgia factor, but also because I do think there are some redeemable, enjoyable qualities about those movies. But also because I enjoy the character of Megatron, period. I mean, he's this brutal warlord who is in charge of his own destiny. He does not take shit from anyone. Whenever other powers or individuals try to control him, Megatron always ferociously resists. Like even in G1, Megatron or Galvatron at that point resisted becoming Unicron's slave, but because of the overwhelming awesome power of Unicron, he had no choice but to bow before him. but Megatron in the Bayformer seems to lack all of this sort of independent agency. And when he does gain this independent agency, it rarely serves his character in any meaningful way. It rarely pans out in any meaningful way, like in movie three when he, attacks Sentinel, and then a few moments later he becomes a sputtering corpse. Or in movie five, when he basically just serves Quintessa loyally throughout the whole film just to get Cybertron back. But the scheme fails, and at that point, Megatron, I think he should just be wondering, maybe I should just take my troops, whoever I have left, like Shockwave, Barricade. Well, Shockwave's dead. I mean, all the good Decepticons from Transformers lore died in movie three in the Battle of Chicago. Afterwards, he just has like shitty remnants and stupid drones and stuff that I don't really care for. But I mean, whenever like after the ending of any of these movies, after movie one, which is, in my opinion, the only understandable ending for Megatron as a character, because afterwards, after every movie ends, you begin to you got to think like maybe he's just like maybe I shouldn't be serving all these like crazies and yahoos anymore. Maybe I should just take whoever I have left and go to Cybertron and rebuild it myself manually. Like I don't know why that thought's never occurred to him. It apparently occurred to him in the Dark of the Moon novelization, but again, I'm mainly going over the Bayformers in this movie, and for this list, I look at the canon that's most popular, quote unquote, or the canon that most people are familiar with, and by and large, for Bayformers Megatron, that is the movies he is featured in. And in these movies, it just kind of seems like he's a dawdling, crazy, gangling, angular, ugly, misshapen, fucking boulder of metal, just making his way through the universe, serving everything from dark gods to fallen primes to again another dark god in the form of Quintessa, or to having multiple schizo personality disorder when he's Galvatron, but actually Megatron because like he becomes Megatron again in movie five. I mean, it just does not make any sense. And it just feels like throughout these movies, he's just an archaeologist going after various relics, and his entire Decepticon army has just kind of been roped into this crazy relic quest. When I do believe, like in movie one, in the first Transformers movie, it was very clear that Megatron and his troops outmatched the Autobots and the human military heavily. And of course, these were the elite Decepticons. You know, you had Blackout, Starscream, not Grindor, he shows up in two, but you had Blackout, Starscream, Frenzy, Megatron himself, of course, Brawl, right? Barricade. Barricade is an elite, competent fighter, despite the fact that he's a huge coward. But the point of the matter is, like, you had all these Decepticon elites, and admittedly, because you had all these elites, you might get a skewed view that like an average Decepticon could do the damage in movie one that those select Decepticons did. But I'm sure that even the average Decepticon was stronger than the average Autobot, considering that Optimus had to draw from the advanced science division of Cybertron, and Megatron's troops were the like military sect of Cybertron. Like Optimus had Ironhide, and the RC twins or whoever like that. He had a few military veterans on his team throughout the Bayformers saga, but for the most part, it was just like repurposed scientific or exploratory droids or Autobots or whatever. And Megatron had this like pool of advanced military hardware at his disposal, and he uses it to like serve every manner of crazy Yahoo megalomaniacal villain instead of serving his own whims of rebuilding Cybertron, which is a huge detractment against his competency. In fact, the only reason I don't put him lower on this tier list is kind of because of the success of his schemes. Like if you look at his like his if we look at the outward expressed goal of Megatron in these movies, it's to revive Cybertron, right? It's to bring back the glory of his homeworld. And in doing that, I do think he is very consistent throughout the films. He wants to either rebirth Cybertron on Earth or bring it back somehow by harvesting Earth's sun and using it as an energy source to revitalize Cybertron by creating more energon for his people, or straight up bringing Cybertron into Earth's orbit, which he's done twice at this point in the Bayformers canon. But while he is consistent in his goals, similar to Emperor Bellows, who I reviewed earlier, you can check out that video. But while he is consistent in his goals, he is not very competent at achieving those goals. He kind of has the mind of a brute force warrior. He really is a barbarian in every sense of the word. He's never really grown out of that like sort of militaristic, tribalistic mindset that Sentinel probably, which was probably the reason Sentinel overlooked him for leadership over Cybertron and probably gravitated towards Optimus, because Megatron is this frothing, crazy madman who is easily swayed by like the Fallen, who, by the way, just spends the entirety of the Bayformer sitting on his ass and then showing up at one battle in Egypt and fucking dying. or Sentinel Prime, who just very clearly sees Megatron as a means to an end, and his Decepticons as a means to an end to like rule over Cybertron as the sole sovereign, or Quintessa, who just wants to murder Unicron. Um, I mean, honestly, I don't even know what Quintessa's motivations were. I think Megatron just ended up serving her because she saved his life when, or gave him his old identity back when he was Galvatron. Um, so with that out of the way, there's not much I can say in Megatron's defense. And like using a nostalgia factor to defend him would just be unfair because like a lot of villains on this tier list that I've covered prior, or a lot of villains that I will cover, are not say like I haven't seen their media as a kid. I've seen them as an adult or a teenager. So with that out of the way, like I'm not going to use my love of the Bayformers movies, at least 1 through 3, to defend Megatron in any way, shape, or form. What I am going to do is admit that Megatron, at least in the comics and the extended, franchise lore, and in the movies, to a degree, has been very close to achieving his goal of bringing back Cybertron to its glory era after his war just hollowed and emaciated it out and turned it into a wreckage, a ruin, a smoldering, emanation of its former self. And he does almost achieve that a few times. And in the Dark of the Moon novelization, he actually does take his Decepticons and just leave for Cybertron. But again, the novelization it doesn't really count here. Um, the novelization, in fact, it's not because it's not canon to the Bayformers, right? Like, at least that specific novelization. So I'm not going to use it. I'm only using canon material to the Bayformers universe, which includes the movies and some of the comics, because Michael Bay has never really contested their canonical nature, probably because he just doesn't really give a shit. Um, and in movie 5, The Last Night, they say the Autobots come in like during the midst of World War II or something, even though apparently the first time they showed up was in the first movie. So at that point, I just think that Bayformers canon is a jumbled mess that to untangle it would take a video of its own and not really something I'm willing to put time or effort into right now. So all that said, for our boy Megatron, at least Bayformers Megatron, the huge angular, mating of metal that we see swaggering about in every movie, just, voiced by Hugo Weaving and then eventually Frank Welker. And, to be honest, I can kind of see why Hugo Weaving was just tuned out by Dark of the Moon. But, it is what it is. I will give him a solid, um, flawed but still fearsome. He's a flawed but still fearsome character. And I might go over the other Bayformers villains, the Fallen, the Sentinel Prime, Quintessa, whoever else, later on this tier list, but probably not for a while. This will be my first and probably only Bayformers entry for a good while. And, I figured if I was going to go over any Bayformers villain, it had to be Megatron himself. Because despite it all, despite everything, he is still the villain that is featured in every single movie, in whatever form or name he takes, and whatever, like, body he's inhabiting. He is still the enemy of the Autobots, the enemy of humanity, the deranged militaristic, extremist that wants to see Cybertron and Cybertronians ruling at the center of the universe. So with all that in mind, um, you know, good job, good effort, Megatron. But you're fearsome. But compared to a lot of other villains on this list, and compared to a lot of villains that we will be reviewing in the very near future, you just don't really hold up, man. I'm sorry. But with that out of the way, Darksiders, remember that if you do not like, comment, and subscribe, that would be very unwise. See what I did there? Because Megatron says so unwise in movie 1. Anyway, whatever. Who gives a shit? Anyway, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Comment what villains you'd like to see next. Comment your thoughts on this video. Make sure to give it a like if you enjoyed, and make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button for more notifications when you want to see more videos from my channel when they're released. And with that out of the way, my friends, thank you all, and peace, Darksiders.